A few years ago, after the wildfires in the Pacific Northwest, I went on a walk down a trail that had just reopened. You could still smell the smoke weeks later. The air was heavy. There was charred trunks that looked like these silent sentinels that were gracing this path. The ground still crunched with that ash that was left over, and the birds that were often lively and loud were quiet. Almost like they weren't sure if they were allowed to sing just yet. The fire had passed, the emergency had ended, but it didn't feel like healing yet. It felt like absence. And the path, that was familiar. I had walked it before, but the atmosphere had completely changed, and I could see these little specks of new greenery. I could see these signposts rebuilt and the benches rebuilt. But it just wasn't this visual change that I was noticing. It was almost unsettling at the same time. You might even say holy to a certain degree. Not in an intense, deep feeling, tingle kind of way, but this slow, haunting, something is happening here kind of way. And I remember thinking in that moment, is this what resurrection feels like? Not triumphant, not polished, not immediate, just raw, tender, even strange, maybe real. The moment came flooding back to me as I was reflecting on our story today in Luke 24, because this is where I believe resurrection, or the journey of resurrection, actually begins for us. Not with any performance or big display. There's no spotlight, no big blasts of fireworks. There was just two people walking away from everything they thought they believed, with confusion, with disappointment, with this slow step down a dusty road. And today, as Sharon said, we're beginning this new series called New Life Through the Risen Christ, where Easter was last Sunday, and we often can think and celebrate it as a one-weekend event and moment and say, Christ is risen, and yes, he is. But resurrection is not the end of the story. It is actually just the beginning. It's the start of something ongoing, something that is completely unfolding before our eyes. And over these next few weeks, we'll walk with Jesus again, post-resurrection this time, watching how he restores hope, how he reorients mission, how he breathes out the Spirit and calls his followers into a renewed way of life. All the while, I hope, trying to ask the question, what does resurrection really do? And so we start our journey today on a road, what I would like to call a very human road, a road of confusion, of slow realization, and in hopes that we can maybe learn what it is that Jesus might be doing for us and showing us in this path. And so today we're going to slowly walk through the story, one step at a time, as we explore how Jesus meets us on the road, how he shows up on this road of disappointment, how he reveals himself in ordinary ways, and how he might invite us to return back transformed. Beginning at Luke 24, verses 13 to 16, we read these words. Now the same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles or 10 kilometers from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they walked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. Let's just take a moment and step into this particular story in Luke's gospel. So it's the afternoon of the day of resurrection, which for us would have been last Sunday afternoon. Earlier that morning, the tomb had already been found empty. The women had returned breathless. The disciples were in disbelief. There was confusion, grief, rumors, half whispers that had filled every room in Jerusalem. And these two disciples, well, they had had enough. They don't stay in the city to investigate. They start walking away. We don't exactly know why they're walking and going to Emmaus. Maybe it's home for them. Maybe it's anywhere but here. Maybe they're returning to what's familiar. Because staying in that disappointment, in that trauma, in that absence just felt like too much for them. But what we do know is that it was 10 kilometers away, a journey that's the length of this morning's sun run. And we know one of them is named Cleopas and the other one is unnamed, perhaps intentionally, maybe so we might actually be able to see ourselves in the story and in their shoes. These two are not part of the inner 12. We know that as well. But they are disciples. They've been close enough to witness what's happened. They've heard the reports. They likely watched Jesus die. They are not casual followers. They are heartbroken ones in this story. And this journey is actually a walk of transition that we'll see. The grief being this bridge for what would come next. And I think that the timing of the day matters. It's late in the day. The light is starting to fade. The shadows are growing longer. So I like to imagine that this road and this story is in the mood of heaviness. It's dim. It's tired. Plus, I imagine these two disciples walking with their shoulders slumped, words pouring out like questions with no punctuation. And then we read in Luke, verses 15 to 16, that Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. These two disciples are processing probably the most gut-wrenching weekend of their lives, and Jesus just shows up. But they don't recognize him. They don't see him. They don't know who he is. Not because Jesus is hiding from them, but because I believe that resurrection often doesn't look like the way we expect it to. Which honestly, I'll say makes me feel good about my own spiritual cluelessness at times. I mean, truthfully, I've read the Gospels, I've studied the theology, I've preached sermons, I've helped others name Christ in their own lives. And I could very easily be at a grocery store and Jesus could be standing right beside me and I wouldn't know because I'm scanning my phone or looking for the cheapest eggs. Cleopas and his friend aren't doing anything dramatic here. They're not performing a miracle. They're not preaching to a crowd. They're just walking, talking, processing, arguing even. They're trying to make sense of everything that's just happened within them. And I think that's important to notice. Because often when we think of holy moments, I think we imagine these mountaintop experiences or these bright lights or these still small voices inside. But here, the God incarnate, Jesus himself, joins them on a walk. Maybe you've walked a road like that yourself. A road of grief, of disappointment, disorientation. You show up, you keep moving, but something in you lags behind. I think that's where the story of Luke 24 meets us. As we continue, we read in verse 21 these words. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word, deed, and before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death. and they crucified him. And we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. That phrase right there. Oh, we had hoped. It's a telling line, isn't it? We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel. We had hoped. That line is a heartbreak in 3 words. I think that's where many of us can often live. Not in the high drama of betrayal or crucifixion, but in the quiet erosion of what we thought would be. It carries the weight of our dreams that have been deferred, of prayers that felt like they floated away into silence, of trust that didn't seem to hold on in the way that we expected. And we notice here that Luke writes this in the past tense specifically. It's not we still hope or we're trying to hope. It's that we had hoped, meaning they had already started to let the hope die. I think if we're honest with ourselves, those 3 words could be written across many chapters of our own lives, right? We had hoped. We'd hoped that the depression would lift. We'd hoped that the marriage would heal. We'd hoped that the church would be different, that the acts of yesterday wouldn't have existed, that we would finally feel at home here. We'd hoped that our children would believe, that our prayers would be answered, whether quickly, clearly, and on time. Maybe your heart has whispered that sentence recently. Maybe it's still whispering it now. Disappointment doesn't always come crashing in. Sometimes it seeps in. Now, if I'm being honest with you, I don't always realize that I'm walking that road in particular until I start reacting in a way that my friends have now dubbed as prickly. You know what I mean? That moment when it's like I'm going about my day, everything seems to be fine, and then suddenly I get this like jolt of a reaction that comes out of nowhere that feels out of the ordinary. I get frustrated, I get upset, I push back, I get a little snippy, I shut down. I have a lot of emotions to pick from with me in particular. And in that moment, a friend will see me and say, "Nathan, you're being a little prickly right now." And that's when I realize, reluctantly, I think I'm carrying some type of disappointment I haven't acknowledged yet. Some grief or sadness I haven't chosen to acknowledge yet. And I haven't dealt with it. I think sometimes it sneaks up on us like that. What these disciples are feeling is grief, real, aching grief. And it's disorienting. David Kessler, a leading grief researcher, once said, "Each person's grief is as unique as their fingerprint." That's true of physical death. But it's also true of lost dreams, of spiritual disappointment, that slow death of uncertainty. I mean, these disciples had just watched Jesus die. But they're also grieving what his death meant for them. They were hoping for a kingdom and they got a cross. They were wanting victory and they got silence. And what's wild and maybe even humbling at times is that Jesus is walking with them while they're explaining to Jesus why they're so disappointed in Jesus. Isn't that what we often do ourselves? We walk with Jesus and tell him how much he has failed us, not knowing he's the one actually holding us up while we're going through it. And here's what's stunning to me is that in verse 22, the disciples say these words. "In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive." I mean, they had heard the report, the evidence was clear in front of them, but disappointment is like this thick fog, and they can't see through it. I think disappointment has this unique way and ability to kind of narrow our own vision. It shrinks possibility. It turns what could be resurrection into rumor. And here's the painful, honest truth with it. Sometimes we're so fixated on what we had hoped Jesus would be that we actually miss who he actually is, standing right there in front of us and beside us, right here. Fleming Rutledge, the Episcopal theologian, in her book, The Crucifixion, Understanding the Death of Jesus Christ, writes these words: "The crucifixion is the touchstone of Christian authenticity, the unique feature by which everything else is to be evaluated." In other words, it's not just resurrection that defines us, it's the fact that Jesus enters into disappointment and death first. I mean, we don't worship a God who avoids suffering. We worship one that chooses to walk with us down this road, even if we don't see him, even when our vision is blurry, even when our hope has gone silent. And so let's name it today. Take a moment and just reflect. Is there a place where disappointment and delusion has kind of crept in? Maybe you're in a season of doubt. Maybe it's a season of distance. Maybe it's disappointment. You might be showing up to church today, but checking out in your soul. You might be walking like Cleopas and his friend, not because you're faithless, but because you're still trying to stay in the process of it, trying to survive. For whatever reason you are on the dusty road, for whatever reason you are feeling the absence, you need to know this: Jesus is not offended by your disappointment. He joins it. He walks with it. He lets you talk. And then slowly and patiently and tenderly begins to reveal himself. But for now, for this moment, you're just walking. And that's absolutely okay. Let's continue to verse 28. We read these words: "As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going farther. But they urged him strongly, 'Stay with us, for it is nearly evening, and the day is almost over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight." As Cleopas and his friend keep walking, this mysterious fellow, Jesus, opens the scripture to them, showing how the Messiah had to suffer, how the story of Israel, God's redemption story, always included this kind of pain and reversal. Then, as they approached the village, they chose to invite this stranger in to stay with them. And Jesus was sharing the scriptures of on the road. Their hearts started to burn. They didn't fully know why yet, but something is happening deep within the surface. You know that feeling, that moment where you're like, is this God doing something here? Feeling? I get that sometimes, and it's what I like to call like the slow burn. This is the quiet stirring. It's like when we don't really know that we're hungry until someone passes us a plate of fries and we go, "Oh, yeah, this is good." Or when you don't know how the heavy silence was, how much it was, until someone asks, "How are you doing, really?" Sometimes Jesus shows up not with these fireworks, but with warmth. And sometimes maybe that's better. Because I feel like we don't forget warmth. We tend to carry warmth with us. It stays with us. It lingers. And as they get to their destination, Jesus acts like he's going farther, right? Because of course he does. I like to sometimes pretend that Jesus leans towards this flare of dramatics. And then the disciples are like, no, stay with us. It's almost nighttime. And then they invite him in, they set the table, they break bread, and that's the moment. Not in a temple, not during a miracle, but over dinner. He took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And that's when their eyes were opened. I love it so much because it is just so simple and so ordinary. This is not some big revival service. No angel choirs are here, no fog machines, no spectacle, just food, just table, just presence. Almost 10 years ago, right after, I'm going to get emotional, right after moving here from Toronto to Vancouver, I was in one of the lowest seasons of my life. There was a friend of mine from Regent who had asked me to go grab like wings and a beer at a pub. And so I just said, yeah, great, I'll come with you. And we started talking, not talking about theology, not really talking about much of life or our own stuff. It was just aimless chattering. And then halfway through this plate of hot wings, he looks up at me and says these words, I feel like there's something going on with you. Like you're wearing a mask of joy and happiness, but deep down you just feel absent. Like you're trying to hold things together, but you don't really know what you're holding on to. But know that you don't have to do this alone. And he looks at me right in the eye and goes, I'm here. God's here. He had no clue what was going on in my life and what I was feeling. And yet those words that he spoke to me, I cried into my wet naps because I hadn't heard that type of gentle voice with such clarity in so long. My sight was foggy for so long, and for the first time, I could see growth again, new life again. And what amazes me about all of this is that it just didn't come in church. It didn't happen anywhere spiritual. It happened over a plate of wings. I like to think that that's what Jesus does. He doesn't wait for the spiritual moment. He makes the moment spiritual every time. And can we just pause for a second as we think about him and appreciate the fact that Jesus, the one who is like fully resurrected, glorified, the Son of God, this beginning and end, is just playing dumb for hours with these two as they walk down the road. He's like, what things? Oh, wow, tell me more about this Jesus guy. And I mean, it makes me happy. It makes me smile. Because it's both hilarious and also deeply gracious of him. He meets them where they are, not with answers, but with questions. He lets them process, and when the time is right, when they're ready, he shows up fully, clearly, intimately. And how does he do it? Well, he doesn't preach. He eats. He simply breaks bread, he blesses it, and then their eyes are opened. In her poem, Christ Has No Body, St. Teresa of Avila wrote these words: Christ has no body on earth but yours. No hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes with which he looks compassion on this world. And I wonder, how many times have you been Christ to someone without even realizing it? There are moments, ordinary, small, easily overlooked moments where the presence of Christ is revealed through you without anyone, including you yourself, fully realizing it at the time. Maybe it's in the way that you just welcomed someone, the way you listened to them, the way you sat beside them in their ache. Maybe it's because you made them soup, or you sat in the grief with them because they didn't know what else to do. These two disciples didn't recognize Jesus until after the bread. And then they look at each other and say, weren't our hearts burning? In other words, this recognition came in hindsight. And isn't that often true for us? How many times have we only seen God's fingerprints until once the dust settles? We look back and say, that was him? And I missed it. Whether it's that phone call, that text, that friend who stayed a little longer than they needed to, that song on the radio that hit just right. He was there. He was walking. He was waiting. He was breaking bread. So let me ask this question for you. What's on your table right now that Jesus might be using to open your eyes? Is it a conversation that you've been avoiding? A meal that you need to slow down for? A person you've written off as just ordinary? Christ is here with you. And if your heart's been burning, if something deep inside is beginning to stir, maybe it's in this moment. Maybe just pay attention to it. Don't ignore it. As we keep reading in Luke, verse 33 and 34, it says these words, they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem, saying, it's true, the Lord has risen. Their eyes were opened, and then they ran back. They ran in the dark 10 kilometers after dinner. And I don't know about you, but after a full meal, there's no way I'm going for a run at all. I'm not running anywhere, not 1K, not 10K. But when your heart, I think, is set on fire, when you finally see Jesus, when the absence is no longer, I think this is what happens to us. We get energized and we have to move. When disappointment is met by presence, when questions are met with companionship, when bread is broken and eyes are opened. You don't just sit there. You go. And these guys are literally on the same road that they were just coming down that they walked in disappointment. It's the same dirt, the same hills, the same distance for them. But what is different? That's the question. And the answer is they are. Their pace, their purpose, their posture, it's all changed. They walked to Emmaus in grief, and they run back to Jerusalem in resurrection. Because when you've seen the risen Christ, even just for a moment, you want others to see him too. Sometimes the holiest thing is to just go back. Back to the city, back to the community, back to the friends who are still stuck in that metaphorical Saturday. The resurrection didn't airlift these two out of their context. It sent them back into it. Maybe you've been waiting for a new road yourself. A new job, a new city, a new purpose itself. But maybe Jesus is calling you now to just return, to go back to the same house, to the same relationship, to the same broken world, but with new eyes. I feel like I need to be very clear here that returning does not mean going back to how things were. It does not mean re-entering the trauma. It does not mean excusing the abuse. It does not mean pretending the pain didn't happen. Jesus isn't asking the disciples to forget what they experienced. He's inviting them to walk back into their world with new eyes, with renewed courage, with resurrection deep within their bones. To return is not to rewind. It is not to minimize what happened. It's to step forward into what God is now doing, sometimes in the very places we once ran from. But now you go not in fear. You go in freedom. You go carrying bread and a story. You go as someone who has seen Christ, maybe in the breaking, maybe in the burning. And now you return transformed. The disciples didn't return to Jerusalem the same way they left it. They went back resurrected. They went back with breadcrumbed hands and these burning hearts. And so if you find yourself here in the story, if you've walked this road of disappointment, if you've ever been open, if your eyes have ever been opened, if your heart has begun to burn again, or even if it's just a little flicker, I think the next step for you is movement. Madeleine L'Engle, the author of the Wrinkle in Time series in particular, wrote this brilliant book about faith and art, one of my favorite books. It's called Walking on Water. And she explores this ability to connect intellect and spiritual insights together. And in it, she said this: we draw people to Christ not by loudly discrediting what they believe, but by showing them a light so lovely that they want with all their hearts to know the source of it. This is what the disciples carried on that road. Not a theology degree, not a clever argument, but lovely light. A story, a moment, a meal. And maybe that's why Jesus vanished right after the bread. I like to think that it's because he didn't want them to just be addicted to his appearance. He wanted them to trust in his presence. You may not always see Christ, but we always have the table. And in a few moments, that's where we're all getting the opportunity to head to the table, to the place where bread is still broken, where eyes still open, where Christ is still made known. Not in perfect clarity, but in communion. So wherever you are on the road today, disappointment, recognition, or just the beginning of return for yourself, know this: Christ is with you, whether you see him or not. And he walks your questions. He joins your silence. He stays for dinner. And when you're ready, he lets you return back. To your family, to your calling, to the places you left behind, to the people who still need to hear the story at the end of the day. And so today, come to the table. Come to the table with your confusion, with your disappointment, with your heart that burns and your hands that might shake. Come to the table not because you understand, but because you've been met. Come because this bread is how we remember, and also how we recognize that resurrection is here. Let's pray. Risen Jesus, open our eyes to see you in the breaking of bread, in the burning of hearts, and in the faces we walk beside. Give us the courage to return, not as we are, but as people transformed by your presence. Amen.